In the history of European kingdoms, few stories have achieved the blend of drama, passion, and eccentricity surrounding the life of Pedro I of Portugal, known to some as Pedro the Just and to others as Pedro the Cruel. But beyond the nicknames that attempt to encapsulate his character, there is one episode that defines his legacy with such a peculiar brilliance that it seems plucked from a Gothic novel: the supposed coronation of a corpse. Yes, you read that correctly. Pedro I, in a gesture oscillating between boundless love and theatrical madness, is said to have ordered the exhumation of his beloved Inês de Castro's body to crown her queen after her death. How did it come to this? Is it true, or an exaggeration by chroniclers? Let us dive into this story, with one foot in historical fact and the other in the slippery realm of legend, but always with a knowing wink at the absurdity that sometimes defines human passions. To understand this tale, we must step back to 14th century Portugal, a small but ambitious kingdom caught between noble intrigues and tensions with Castile. Pedro, born in 1320 in Coimbra, was the son of Afonso IV, a pragmatic king who ruled with a firm hand, though not always with the subtlety required by the politics of the time. Afonso IV, nicknamed the Brave, had solidified the throne after a period of instability, and his reign was marked by a constant effort to keep Portugal a relevant player on the Iberian Peninsula. However, the Portuguese court was a hotbed of ambitions, where nobles schemed in torchlit halls and rumors spread faster than galloping messengers. In this context, Pedro grew up as heir to the throne, a young man of strong character, trained in the arts of war and diplomacy, but with a penchant for intense emotions that would make him both celebrated and, at times, feared. Pedro was no ordinary prince. Chroniclers of the time, such as Fernão Lopes, describe him as a man of contrasts. He could be generous and loyal to his allies but ruthless with his enemies. Tall, with a regal bearing and a piercing gaze that seemed capable of unraveling anyone's secrets, he was admired by young nobles for his love of hunting and chivalric tournaments. Yet he also had an introspective side, a sensitivity that led him to obsess over ideals like justice or, as we shall see, love. This duality, between warrior and dreamer, would be key to understanding his decisions, especially those involving Inês de Castro. Inês de Castro, the woman who would change Pedro's fate, was a Galician noblewoman born around 1325 in the Limia region, within the powerful Castro family. The Castros were no ordinary clan. They had ties to Castile's high nobility and a reputation as shrewd players in the peninsula's political chessboard. Inês, however, was not a direct heiress or a major figure in her family, making her an unlikely candidate to star in one of the Middle Ages' most famous love stories. Her beauty, according to chronicles, was her greatest weapon. Her skin was said to be pale as snow, her eyes sparkled with intelligence, and she possessed a natural grace that charmed everyone she met. Beyond her appearance, Inês had a magnetic personality, a blend of sweetness and determination that made her unforgettable. Inês arrived in Portugal in 1340 as a lady-in-waiting to Constanza Manuel, Pedro's new wife. Constanza, the daughter of a Castilian noble, had been betrothed to Pedro as part of a diplomatic agreement to strengthen ties between Portugal and Castile. Their marriage, as was typical of the era, had nothing to do with love. It was a political contract, a strategic move in the game of crowns. Constanza was a virtuous woman, raised to fulfill her role as wife and future queen, but she lacked the effortless charisma that Inês exuded. The Portuguese court, ever attuned to power dynamics, quickly noticed that Pedro, then a young man of about 20, seemed more interested in his wife's lady-in-waiting than in his bride. The relationship between Pedro and Inês began, according to accounts, as a discreet flirtation, hidden behind stolen glances and conversations in the palace gardens. But it soon deepened into something more profound. Pedro, never particularly devoted to courtly norms, found in Inês a companion who not only captivated him physically but shared his emotional intensity. Inês, for her part, was no naive maiden. She knew that falling in love with the heir to the throne was a dangerous game, yet she seemed unable to resist the passion that bound them. Rumors of their romance soon reached the ears of Afonso IV, who, as a prudent king, saw in this affair not a love story but a threat to the kingdom's stability. The issue wasn't just that Pedro was married to Constanza. Inés, as a Galician and a member of the Castro family, posed a political danger. The Castros held significant influence in Castile, and her presence in the Portuguese court could be interpreted as a maneuver to align Portugal with Castilian interests. Furthermore, Inés's brothers, Álvaro and Fernando de Castro, were ambitious nobles who made no secret of their desire for power on the peninsula. For Afonso IV, his son's relationship with Inés was not just a personal scandal but a ticking time bomb that could destabilize Portugal's fragile alliances. He tried to intervene, first with veiled warnings and later with harsher measures, such as banishing Inés from court, but nothing could extinguish the fire between the lovers. The situation reached a breaking point in 1345 when Constanza died after giving birth to Fernando, the son who would secure the dynasty's continuity. Though tragic, Constanza's death could have been an opportunity for Pedro and Inés to legitimize their relationship. However, Afonso IV had other plans. Pressured by his advisors and the Portuguese nobility, who viewed the Castro's influence with suspicion, the king firmly opposed any notion of Inés taking an official role in the court. Instead of allowing Pedro to marry her, Afonso sought to arrange a new marriage for his son, one that would bolster the kingdom's political alliances. But Pedro, stubborn as he was, had no intention of giving up Inés. Here, the story takes an even more novelistic turn. Defying the king's orders, Pedro and Inés began living together in an unofficial union. They settled in the Santa Clara Palace in Coimbra, far from the prying eyes of the Lisbon court. There, surrounded by a small circle of loyal followers, they raised their children, Afonso, Beatriz, João, and Dinis, born of a relationship that, though unrecognized by the church or the king, was as valid to Pedro as any marriage. Chroniclers describe this period as a brief moment of happiness in Pedro's life, a time when he could live his love free from the chains of politics. But in the Middle Ages, a prince's happiness rarely lasted long. Increasingly concerned about Inés's and her brother's influence, Afonso IV decided to take drastic measures. In 1355, while Pedro was away, a group of assassins, allegedly acting on the king's orders, stormed the Santa Clara Palace. Inés, who, according to legend, pleaded for her life and her children's, was brutally executed. The details of her death vary by source. Some say she was beheaded, others stabbed, but all agree it was a calculated act of cruelty meant to send a message to Pedro and anyone who dared defy the king's authority. When Pedro returned and found Inés's body, his reaction was, to put it mildly, explosive. Chroniclers recount that he swore vengeance, his grief transforming into a rage that terrified the court. Some say he wept over Inés's body for days, refusing to let her be buried, as if he could keep her by his side through sheer will. Others, in more dramatized accounts, suggest he kissed her cold lips, foreshadowing the macabre ceremony to come. What is certain is that Inés's death not only shattered Pedro emotionally but turned him into a man obsessed with justice, or rather, his own version of it. Pedro soon rebelled against his father. For 2 years, Portugal teetered on the brink of civil war as Pedro rallied an army of loyalists and planned to challenge Afonso IV. The court, torn between loyalty to the king and sympathy for the wounded prince, became a battleground of intrigues. Finally, in 1357, Pedro's mother, Queen Beatriz of Castile, brokered a truce between father and son. Afonso IV died shortly after, and Pedro ascended the throne as Pedro I. But peace did not bring forgetfulness. Now wielding absolute power, Pedro had a debt to settle with Inés. Here, the story reaches its most extraordinary climax. According to Fernão Lopes' chronicle, written decades later, Pedro ordered Inés's body exhumed in 1360, several years after her death. Not only did he proclaim her Queen of Portugal, but he staged a ceremony in which her corpse, dressed in royal garments and placed on a throne, was presented before the court. Nobles, forced to pay homage, reportedly kissed the hand of the body in a scene blending the macabre with the theatrical. Did this really happen? Modern historians are skeptical. Lopes' chronicle, though valuable, is written with a tone that seeks to glorify Pedro and dramatize his reign. The coronation may have been an exaggeration, a symbolic way to reflect Pedro's obsession with vindicating Inés. But even if it didn't happen exactly as described, the story's endurance speaks volumes about Pedro's image as a king driven by larger-than-life passions. Pedro didn't stop at honoring Inés in death. He also pursued her assassins with a determination bordering on obsession. Two of them, Pêro and Álvaro Gonçalves, were captured in Castile and extradited to Portugal. According to legend, Pedro condemned them to a death so brutal that even his allies shuddered. Their hearts were torn out, one through the chest and the other through the back, while the king watched. This episode, though likely embellished, reinforces Pedro's image as a man whose justice was as fervent as his love. The story of Pedro and Inés doesn't end with the coronation of the corpse. As king, Pedro ruled Portugal until 1367, leaving a complex legacy. He was a monarch who strengthened royal justice, punishing corrupt nobles and protecting peasants, but also a ruler feared for his severity. His reign was marked by conflicts with Castile and the constant memory of Inés, whom he honored with the construction of two magnificent tombs in the Alcabaca monastery. These stone-carved tombs, depicting scenes of their love and tragedy, testify to Pedro's devotion, a reminder that, for him, Inés was always his queen, in life and in death. The story of Pedro and Inés has inspired poets, playwrights, and artists through the centuries. From Coelho's tragedies to modern operas, their love has been romanticized as a symbol of immortal passion. But behind the myth lies a more complex reality. A man torn between duty and desire, a woman whose beauty and ambition made her a pawn in a deadly game, and a kingdom oscillating between stability and chaos. The coronation of the corpse, whether truth or legend, encapsulates this complexity with an image that is both grotesque and deeply human. For, in the end, Pedro I teaches us that love, like power, can lead us to places where reason dares not tread. Life in the 14th century Portuguese court was a microcosm of the tensions defining medieval Europe. Nobles, ever watchful for opportunities to gain influence, observed Pedro's every move with a mix of fear and fascination. His relationship with Inés, though scandalous, was not unique. Royal affairs were common, but they rarely reached the level of open defiance that Pedro represented. His refusal to abandon Inés, even after Constanza's death, not only enraged Afonso IV but alienated a significant portion of the nobility, who saw Inés as a dangerous foreigner. Inés's brothers, Álvaro and Fernando, didn't help matters. Known for their arrogance and political maneuvering, their presence at court fueled suspicions that the Castros sought to dominate Portugal through Inés. The Santa Clara Palace, where Inés and Pedro took refuge, was a place of contrasts. Situated on the banks of the Mondego River, it was a sober stone building with gardens that invited contemplation. There, far from Lisbon's bustle, Pedro could briefly pretend to be just a man, not a prince. Inés's children grew up in relative freedom, surrounded by loyal servants and a small circle of supporters. But even in this sanctuary, politics cast its shadow. Afonso IV's spies watched their every move, and rumors that Inés planned to secure the throne for her children over Constanza's son, Fernando, fed the king's paranoia. Inés's death in 1355 was a point of no return. Though details of the murder are uncertain, chronicles recount it with stark brutality. Some say Inés knelt before her assassins, pleading for her children, while the men, unmoved, carried out the king's orders. Others suggest she tried to flee but was caught in a palace corridor. What is certain is that her death was no accident but a deliberate act meant to assert royal authority. Pedro's reaction was so intense it shocked even his allies. Some accounts claim he locked himself with Inés's body for days, refusing to let it be buried. Others say he held an impromptu funeral, covering her body with flowers and dressing it in the jewels he had given her in life. These details, though likely exaggerated, reflect the depth of his grief. But Pedro's pain didn't end with mourning. It fueled a rage that led him to wage a civil war against his father. The Civil War, though brief, was a time of great tension in Portugal. Pedro rallied an army of loyalists, many of them nobles who saw in his cause a chance to challenge Afonso IV's authority. The court split into two factions, one supporting the king, the other the prince. Battles were small but bloody, and the kingdom held its breath as father and son clashed in a conflict that threatened to tear it apart. Queen Beatrice's intervention secured a fragile truce, but Afonso IV's death soon after left Pedro with absolute power, and a wound that would never heal. The coronation of the corpse, if it happened, was a final act of defiance. The image of an exhumed body, dressed in royal robes and presented before the court, is so vivid it's hard not to picture, even if historians doubt its truth. Fernão Lopes, the chronicler who recounts this tale, writes with a mix of admiration and awe. For him, the ceremony was not just madness. It was a declaration that Inês, in life or death, was Portugal's rightful queen. Nobles, forced to pay homage, must have felt a mix of horror and resignation. After all, no one dared defy a king willing to go so far for love. Pedro's vengeance against Inés's assassins was equally theatrical. Pêro Coelho and Álvaro Gonçalves, captured in Castile, were brought before the king in a public audience. Legend says Pedro watched from his throne as their hearts were torn out, one through the chest, the other through the back, in a gesture symbolizing the pain they had inflicted. Though likely embellished, this story reflects Pedro's image as a man whose justice matched his love in its fervor. The construction of Pedro and Inés's tombs in the Alcobaça monastery is perhaps their most tangible legacy. These Gothic masterpieces, carved with scenes of their love and tragedy, show the couple lying face to face, as if united in death. The inscriptions, speaking of eternal love and divine justice, remind visitors of Pedro's obsession with preserving Inés's memory. Even today, those who visit the monastery can feel the weight of a story that transcends time. Ultimately, the story of Pedro and Inés is a meditation on the power of love and its consequences. It is a tale of passion, sacrifice, and vengeance, but also of humanity. Pedro, with all his contradictions, was a man who lived at the edge of his emotions, a king who defied his era's norms for a woman who, to him, was more than a lover. She was his queen. The coronation of the corpse, whether truth or myth, is the perfect symbol of this obsession, an image capturing the intensity of a love that knew no bounds, not even in death.